and on one occasion when the exact advice of the medium was followed out, and in both instances very highly successfully. One of these fragments of advice at a time when the Union Army was almost in rebellion perhaps had a major effect upon the solution of the war. Another area which had to do with the psychic researches dealt very largely with what you might term religious or mystical convictions, a desire to know, if possible, whether the cause was just, whether it was according to a larger plan. And apparently the psychic phenomena consistently supported this, giving Lincoln certain reassurance that what he was doing was according to the proper will of that power which rules all things. Another area which the author does not go into in any detail, but which apparently played an important part in these trance sessions, was private, personal matters. These seances were held usually only with Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln present, and no detail of the meetings has been preserved. The meetings perhaps suggested something of these curious sleep revelations recorded of Edgar Cayce, where he himself was not aware of what he was saying, but had to hear it later when read back to him either by a secretary or from a tape recording. As there were no tape recordings in those days, and as no secretaries were present, nothing as to what actually transpired was known except to the Lincoln family. And the family apparently never discussed the matter. But they did have sufficient interest and faith in it to make constant use of it. There also seems to have been some point here in connection with the death of Lincoln's son, and perhaps a search for consolation and comfort at a very trying and difficult time. In any event, the picture that we have from the book, which is rather detailed, rather carefully done, is that in the difficult years of the Civil War, Lincoln, while it is not stated or claimed that he was ever a spiritualist, certainly did find some comfort, some help, and some consolation in the consideration of the extrasensory area, that he did through the mediumship of this young woman and others come to a further support of his own convictions on very serious occasions, and was inspired, led, or directed to make several very important moves, including the ranging of his armies outside of Washington as the result of these trance messages which he received. All of this points out, I think, one rather interesting and valuable consideration. That we had in Lincoln at least a man who had a certain sense of the divine plan for things. Lincoln was always groping for this plan. Whether spiritualism was able to greatly solve his question, we do not know. But he was certainly constantly striving for a sensing of the universal pattern underlying things. As a lawyer, he believed in law. He also believed, however, that law had to be administered by righteous men, that law was an instrument by which the innocent could be protected and the guilty could be caught or punished, but that the administering of law depended entirely upon the integrity of the lawyer. That if the lawyer wished to use law as a means of thwarting justice, he could do so. If he wished to use it as a means to bring the criminal to freedom rather than to protect the just man, this could be accomplished by deceit, by subterfuge, by oratory, and by the twisting of law to meet the personal desires and pleasures of individuals. Lincoln sensed that he lived in a universe ruled over by a magnificent law, a great legal structure of some kind. In his own instincts, perhaps somewhat supported by the thinking of the early 19th century, Lincoln became very deeply convinced that there were rules in the universe. And whatever this power of God might be, this God judged righteous judgment. That this God had jobs for men to do. That this God expected to raise up those who would defend it, those who would honor it, those who would give to it the best of themselves and the power which they possessed. Therefore, to Lincoln, law was a great background of value, a great pattern of realities. And it was up to men to find these realities, and it was up to them to have the courage to keep faith with the universal plan of things. To Lincoln, as a lawyer and as a statesman, the responsibility of office was of constant concern. He tells himself of the tremendous amount of conspiracy that surrounded him all the time, and that he was constantly under the most terrible pressures to compromise his principles. That persons of great skill in oratory, individuals with very highly trained minds, tried to dissuade him constantly, tried to argue him out of decisions which he felt to be right and proper. And it was necessary for him, therefore, to feel or sense the presence of some tremendous value factor, something that he could be true to regardless of who opposed him, something that would survive the blunders of men to reestablish the glory of heaven. Lincoln's religion was, of course, almost completely this sensing that the universe belonged to God, and it was the privilege of men to keep this universe in order, to make it that which deity wanted it to be, that there was no other purpose and no other destiny, that it was not at all important what men wanted anything to be. The important thing was that it must be according to the divine will in all things. And apparently Lincoln was a good Bible reader, regardless of whether he was ever affiliated to a group or not. But in his reading, he was like most idealists, inclined to be selective. He selected those parts of the New Testament particularly, which to him represented justice, that represented the compassion of deity and the wisdom which would bring men finally together into a great harmonic cultural pattern. He believed in the goodness of God, released and revealed through the goodness in man himself. I think it might be very practical and very wonderful if something of Lincoln's extremely simple and yet tremendously dynamic philosophy could really find its way into our thinking today, particularly on the levels of leadership. If we could only find these very straight, devout persons who, first of all, as Lincoln felt, no longer regard themselves as carrying the full responsibility of the destiny of the universe. Lincoln never believed that the future of the Union depended utterly upon him. He did not believe that he could frame the Union, or that his rules, his policies, his attitudes were the important things. What Lincoln believed was that there were principles that must preserve the universe and the Union, and that if men would keep these principles, the Union would survive. Everything depended upon these principles. That if these were compromised, all was lost. A splendid structure might rise, but it would fall. because it was not the intended structure. It was not built upon the proper foundations. Nothing built upon corruption can survive, and nothing that is built upon integrity can utterly fail. Thus, the whole structure of Lincoln's way of life was his vision of that which God wanted for America. It was his vision, and he was a simple man, and he admitted it, but he had the strange forthrightness of simplicity. He was not utterly confused by his own intelligence. He was not so calculating and weighing as to judge every argument against every counter-argument. He was not concerned at all by the negative, pessimistic, hopeless attitudes of those around him. He was sorry, but he had to go on and do the thing which he believed needed to be done. Lincoln's concept of the future of his nation was a concept based almost completely upon the new commandments of Christ. He admitted this. He declared that from a standpoint of law, from the standpoint of every principle, these commandments were correct, and that the only hope that we have for the survival of the nation, or for the survival of human civilization, is the deep, abiding respect for the great truths of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. No matter how these be intellectualized or refuted by the mind, regardless of how men evade them and avoid them for the advancement of their own particular causes, these simple truths must live. And if these die, all is lost. To defend these truths, the individual must do that which makes possible the continuance of an increasing and more complete justice, that all things by which deity might bless mankind must be brought to mankind by their leaders in the name of God, that everything that is necessary to give all men their greatest opportunity must be bestowed, and any effort to selfishly withhold that which is needed will ultimately result in weakness and destruction. You cannot win by breaking the rules. You cannot win by ignoring principles. Lincoln had as his basic dream that this nation should become a model for the greater world of humanity. That here in a new world, created by the labors of those who had sought the right of worship, the right of life, the right of freedom, and the right of honor, that in this new world, if these principles endured,